What if a 7-time world champion's entire title challenge came down to 1/10 of a kilometer per hour? That number is confirmed. It is not speculation, not a fan theory, not a paddock rumor. The FIA steward's official documentation from the 2026 Hungarian Grand Prix states it in plain, cold language. Car 44 exceeded the pit lane speed limit of 80 km per hour by exactly 0.1 km per hour. Not 5, not 1, 0.1. Say that number out loud and it barely registers as a number at all. 0.1 km per hour. A fraction of a fraction. And yet, according to the official steward's note, that fraction was enough to trigger a 5-second time penalty that dropped Lewis Hamilton from a genuine podium fight to 5th place in the closing laps of one of the most consequential Grand Prix of the season. 0.1 kilometers per hour. That is the number. Say it again. 0.1. To put that scale into something that means anything outside a Formula One garage, imagine being ticketed in a school zone for driving 1 single centimeter per hour over the limit, caught by a sensor buried in the tarmac. That is roughly the scale of margin the stewards use to reshape a championship weekend. It sounds almost absurd when you say it plainly. But Formula One runs on margins this small every single race weekend. This time, the margin had a name attached to it, and that name was already carrying pressure into Hungary before a single lap had been driven in anger. The stakes heading into the Hungaroring were not subtle, and they were not vague. Heading into the weekend, Kimi Antonelli, at just 19 years old and the youngest championship leader in the sport's history, held the top spot in the drivers' standings. By the time the checkered flag fell, according to Racing News 365, GP fans, and multiple outlets tracking the table, that lead had grown to 50 points over Hamilton, the widest gap recorded at any point in the 2026 season. 11 of 23 races were now complete. Antonelli sits on 219 points. Hamilton trails on 169. Russell third, on 160, 59 points adrift of his own teammate. Leclerc fourth, on 138. Norris fifth, on 128. Verstappen sixth on 109, one solitary point ahead of Piastri, whose retirement in Hungary dropped him to 7th in the standings. In the constructors' fight, Mercedes leads on 379 points, 72 clear of Ferrari's 307, with McLaren now closing to within 99 after finally landing a race win. Hamilton crossed the finish line in 4th place on the road. He was classified 5th, behind his own teammate. 2 positions lost, 5 seconds applied, 50 points now separating him from the top of the championship. These are not speculative figures. These are the numbers printed on the official classification sheet. So why is a 7-time champion, in a car that is capable of genuine podium finishes, watching a 50-point gap open up in the exact race that sends the season into its longest pause? There are 3 reasons, and each one is worse than the one before it. The first cause is procedural, and it began before a competitive lap had even been driven. In final qualifying, Lando Norris finally out-qualified Mercedes for the first time all year, taking pole with Leclerc alongside him on the front row. But behind them, Hamilton was handed a 3-place grid penalty for impeding Oscar Piastri during Q3, a call that, according to Hamilton's own team radio complaint, stemmed from a Ferrari communication failure rather than a driving error on his part. "I was told literally when he was at the apex behind me," Hamilton said afterward, "so I had no idea he was coming." That is not a lapse of car control. That is an operational failure inside the pit wall, and it dropped him from a strong qualifying position down to 5th on the starting grid before Sunday had even begun. Antonelli, in the same session, picked up an identical 3-place penalty of his own for failing to sufficiently slow for a single yellow flag and started the race from 7th instead of 4th. 2 title contenders, both punished before the formation lap, on a grid where Piastri and Verstappen each quietly gained 2 places purely because of those sanctions applied to others. But qualifying penalties are only the beginning of this story, and the second cause runs much deeper than procedure. It is not mechanical at all, it is psychological, and it has been building for 3 straight race weekends. According to the race, and multiple outlets covering the aftermath in Budapest, Hungary marked Hamilton's 4th FIA sanction across 3 consecutive Grand Prix. A false start penalty at Silverstone, a collision-related penalty at Spa involving George Russell, and now, in Hungary, not 1 but 2 separate sanctions inside a single afternoon. Over team radio, Hamilton did not sound like a driver managing a small technical hiccup. He sounded like a man who believed the sport itself had turned against him. "Every opportunity that I give those stewards," he said, "every single time they give me a penalty." Earlier in the weekend, before the pit lane sanction had even arrived, he had already told reporters he can't catch a break. That is not the language of an isolated mistake. That is the language of accumulated frustration, and paddock chatter, according to reporting from the weekend, suggests the tension between Hamilton and race officials is no longer contained to one bad afternoon. It is becoming the defining subplot of his season, and some insiders have noted he even skipped part of the post-qualifying driver's briefing while the grid penalty verdict was still being finalized. And then comes the third cause, the one that turns procedure and frustration into something with an actual physical consequence. On lap 56, under a virtual safety car triggered by Piastri's gearbox failure at turn 3, Ferrari made the call to bring Hamilton in for a third pit stop. In that exact moment, he was engaged in a genuine fight with Antonelli for a podium position, having briefly inherited second place only moments earlier when the VSC was called. The stop cost him track position to both Antonelli and Max Verstappen outright, and in the compressed, adrenaline-loaded seconds of executing that pit release under safety car conditions, with barely a 5-second cushion over Leclerc standing between 4th place and 5th, Hamilton's own operation, according to Ferrari boss Fred Vasseur speaking to Canal+, pressed the pit lane speed limiter release a fraction too early. The result was a driver's hands, under genuine race pressure, moving a sliver of a second out of sync, with a system built with almost zero tolerance for human error in either direction. "This isn't a good result at all," Vasseur said afterward. "We can't be satisfied with this. A team principal, in public, admitting his own operation, cannot be satisfied with itself. That is not a technical footnote anymore. That is a human one." And it followed a driver who, after the race, argued he never should have needed that stop at all, insisting his tires were totally fine and that a genuine fight for third place had been taken out of his hands by his own strategy call. But here is where it gets complicated, because everything that happened across that Hungaroring weekend, the qualifying penalty, the mounting frustration, the mistimed release, the 50-point gap, is not being treated inside Ferrari as a dead end. According to multiple reports filed in the hours after the race, it is being framed internally as precisely the moment that forces a reset. The 4-week summer break begins now, the longest gap anywhere on the 2026 calendar. And for a team sitting 72 points back in the constructors' fight, and a driver 50 points back in the drivers' championship, that break is not simply a pause in the action. Some within the paddock are already describing it as Ferrari's last real window to correct pit wall execution before the second half of the season hardens into something close to unrecoverable. The struggle in Budapest, in other words, is quietly being reframed, not as the end of something, but as the exact pressure required to force the change Ferrari has apparently needed for months. So what actually happened at that pit exit, mechanically speaking, and why can 1/10 of a kilometer per hour decide a race result at all? The pit lane speed limiter, in a modern Formula One car, is not something a driver simply floors and forgets once engaged. It is manually activated and deactivated by the driver, timed against a marked release zone painted onto the track surface, and paired with an electronic torque cap that is supposed to hold the car precisely at the mandated limit, 80 kilometers per hour for this event at the Hungaroring, under conditions further complicated by a virtual safety car controlling the pack's overall speed at the same moment. According to reporting from motorsport.com, Ferrari's internal explanation was that Hamilton engaged the release a fraction early, attempting to optimize his exit timing while racing the clock against Leclerc under that live VSC pressure. The system recorded 80.1 kilometers per hour. The steward's written note is a single sentence long. There is no ambiguity at all in the ruling itself. The ambiguity lives entirely in what actually caused it. And that is exactly where the doubt creeps back in. Split that 0.1 kilometers per hour into its actual components, and it stops looking like a clean, deliberate infraction and starts looking closer to a coin flip. It is a driver's manual reaction time under pressure, layered onto a torque-limiting system with its own tiny built-in lag, layered onto a telemetry sensor carrying its own margin of measurement error, all compressed into a fraction of a second during a live pit release, with a safety car circulating and a teammate 5 seconds behind. Sky Sports pundit Anthony Davidson, reviewing the exact onboard footage the stewards used to justify the penalty, said on air that he could not identify the moment Hamilton had actually exceeded the limit. "I can't work out why he gets a penalty," Davidson said. "For me, he slows down sufficiently well. We've got the marker board on the left-hand side to stipulate the 80 km/h speed limit." A former Grand Prix driver, looking at the very footage the stewards relied on, arriving at the opposite conclusion from the officials who issued the sanction. Some within the paddock have also pointed to a wider pattern this season of drivers being caught marginally over pit limits by these same sensors, suggesting the enforcement threshold itself may be tighter than the technology can consistently justify. If a professional analyst cannot visually confirm an infraction that the telemetry insists occurred, how much of this penalty is genuinely about what Hamilton did in that pit lane, and how much of it is about a measurement system with almost no tolerance for error built into it at all? That lingering doubt does not erase what the 50-point gap actually means heading into the break. Hamilton still sits second in the championship, 9 points clear of Russell, whose own weekend unraveled almost immediately after a disastrous start left him fighting from near the back of the field before recovering only as far as 7th, having also been caught up in a separate blue flag dispute with Carlos Sainz that added yet another layer of controversy to an already chaotic afternoon. But the distance to Antonelli is now the largest it has been at any point in 2026, and it has opened up during precisely the stretch of season that, according to multiple outlets covering the standings, has historically shaped how championship fights ultimately resolve themselves. 4 weeks with no racing means 4 weeks with no opportunity to close that distance, and 4 weeks for a story built on stewards, margins, and mounting frustration to calcify into a wider narrative about whether this remains a genuine two-way title fight at all, or whether it has quietly become something else. Vassar's public dissatisfaction after the race was not just a passing comment about one difficult afternoon. It was, by how it has been reported since, a signal that patience inside Ferrari's own walls has a limit, and Budapest tested it in front of everyone watching. There is a strange footnote sitting underneath all of this too. Hamilton arrived at the Hungaroring as one of the most successful drivers in the history of that circuit, with 8 previous wins there and a corner of the track itself named in his honor this very weekend. Norris, meanwhile, claimed his first win of the 2026 season at a circuit where he had also triumphed the year before, meaning Budapest now belongs to him twice in a row. Further back, the midfield told its own smaller version of the same story. Isack Hadjar held off a late charge from Russell to secure 6th. Liam Lawson finished 8th. Nico Hülkenberg picked up his first points of the season for Audi in 9th, ahead of rookie Arvid Lindblad, and Aston Martin's revised B specification car showed genuine promise with Lance Stroll 13th and Fernando Alonso 14th. None of that changes the story at the front. A driver who has mastered these turns more than almost anyone else on the grid still left Hungary 50 points off the championship lead, undone not by a lack of pace, but by 3 consecutive weekends of penalties layered on top of one another. That contrast, a track built partly around his own legacy, delivering one of the more damaging weekends of his season, is not something anyone in the paddock has fully reconciled yet. So where does this actually leave things heading into the Dutch Grand Prix and the second half of the season? If Ferrari treats this weekend as the wake-up call, it is reportedly being framed as internally tightens its pit wall execution, and Hamilton reigns in the pattern of penalties that has now defined 3 consecutive race weekends. A 50-point gap is still recoverable across the 12 rounds remaining. If it doesn't, if the same execution errors and the same stewarding flashpoints resurface once the season resumes in late August, this quietly becomes the weekend the season actually turned, not through one dramatic collision or one obvious mistake, but through a tenth of a kilometer per hour that a former Grand Prix winner, watching the same footage as the stewards, still cannot say for certain that he saw at all. Do you think that penalty was justified, or do you think the stewards got this one wrong? Let me know in the comments below, and if you want to see exactly how this title fight shifts once racing resumes, make sure you're subscribed before the Dutch Grand Prix.